Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today is April 21st. It is the 105th anniversary of the death of Manfred von Richthofen, otherwise known as the Red Baron, or as he referred to himself in German, der Rote Kampfflieger. So we're going to take a look today at one of my absolute favorite channels on YouTube. In fact, I've had an opportunity to talk with some of the guys who run this channel, and we've interacted a lot and even explored the possibility of me maybe working with them down the road on some stuff here in the States. As far as I'm concerned, one of my favorite ways to learn about battles is by being there. But if I can't actually be at the battlefield itself, this is about as close as you can get. They use maps, they use drones, they use images, they use animation. You'll see what I mean. And I'm so glad to finally see that their channel is taking off. It looks like in the last couple of weeks, the algorithm has finally smiled on this channel, which is called Battle Guide. They were at something like 20,000 subscribers just a couple of weeks ago, averaging a couple hundred new subscribers a week. And all of a sudden, they're getting 20,000 subscribers a week. And it's so good to see. I love seeing great channels finally get the recognition they deserve. So I will put a link in the description to this original content. And I encourage you. In fact, let me just show you some of the stuff they've got on here. And they don't have a ton of videos on here because they actually have a subscription site that I have a subscription to, and I definitely recommend it's worth your time. These are some of the videos they have live. You can see the site where Audie Murphy got his Medal of Honor, stuff about the Führer bunker, stuff about the Battle of the Bulge, World War I sites, the trenches of World War I, the secret World War II commando raid, with just 2 survivors. And then I'll show you some of the stuff that's on their subscription site as well. Because these are just some of their videos. They've actually got 153 videos on here. A lot of them, they've got some live streams, Rorke's Drift, Battle of Mons, Vimy Ridge, a lot of World War I, World War II stuff specifically, but they've got a lot of other things as well. So I'm in now to the subscription site, and you can see here they've got videos on the Boer War. They've got a bunch on the First World War, and these actually came in really handy for me personally when I planned my trip to Ypres to get some ideas about where I wanted to go. They've got the Battle of Sedan from the Franco-Prussian War. They've got videos from the Napoleonic Wars, a bunch of stuff from the Second World War, and every one of these is in the similar style to what you're going to see in this video today about the Red Baron, their use of drones, their use of maps and animation and on-site stuff, and quotes from people who were there, eyewitness accounts, stuff like that. It's fantastic. So enough with my promo. Let's dive into the story of who killed the Red Baron.
1918, deadlock reigned across the Western Front. For more than 3 years, millions of men on all sides have fallen trying to break the stalemate of trench warfare. That struggle would eventually lead both below and above ground, heralding as it did so a new era of warfare and a new type of military icon, the aerial ace. Fighting in single combat in highly unreliable aircraft and freezing conditions, and usually without the benefit of parachutes, it was only the bravest of the brave who took to the skies.
Yeah, so there's a reason why so many people consider the pilots of World War I to be the kind of the Great War equivalent of the knights of medieval times, right? Fighting in single combat, duels, man to man, rather than masses of men on the battlefield, even though sometimes there were large formations. And this is one of the great leaps in technology that's going to be evidence of what is a larger thing happening with World War I, right? Remember, the Wright brothers' first flight is when? In 1903. 11 years before the start of the First World War. And so aircraft technology is a brand new thing, and what it looks like in 1914 is so different than 1918. And the nature of warfare in general, cavalry is on the way out. You're going to have tanks by the end of World War I. Many of these guys who are fighter pilots at the end of the war were in the cavalry at the beginning of the war, including Richthofen, because they recognized very quickly that the cavalry's not going to see a lot of action. He ends up being like a courier in a lot of ways. So he switches, like a lot of guys do, to the flying corps,
where life expectancy was often measured only in hours. The elite of the elite became aces and were celebrated at home as heroes, though few lived to enjoy that status long. Of all of the aces of the Great War, one man stands out: Manfred von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron.
So his title is Friar, which is freeholder. It's basically, it roughly translates to Baron, and it wasn't like some kind of special title. It kind of came with the family, and everybody in the family, all the males, were entitled to that title of Friar. But yeah, the Red Baron's what he goes down in history as. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that you have a number of these aces. I think the life expectancy typically for a pilot from his first action is about 3 weeks. So a lot of these guys get shot down without ever seeing any kind of real victories. But the guys who are good, they stay good for a long time, and because they shoot down a lot of these newbies that just really aren't that good. So there's a big talent gap sometimes between the guys who know what they're doing and the ones who don't.
He too wouldn't live to see the end of the war. This is the incredible story of his final flight. When war was declared in 1914, sustained powered flight was just 11 years old.
Yeah.
That said, the possible applications of aircraft in the military had been seen early. But in such a short time, little progress had been made, and the major powers' respective aerial forces were tiny in 1914, with the British Royal Flying Corps heading to France with just 63 aircraft.
And look at the aircraft they have. Necessity is the mother of invention, right? So as you bog down into trench warfare and you're looking for any advantage you can get, well, you're going to have things like balloons that you're going to put up to try and spot weak points in the line. Well, then you've got to be able to counter those balloons, and so you've got to find a way to shoot those down. Well, now you've got to deal with the guys that are shooting down your balloons. And of course, you have scout aircraft that are flying, and you want to be able to take those out. And so every time somebody finds a new application for airplanes, somebody's got to come up with an answer to that.
It would end the war with a total complement of 22,000 across the globe.
Huge.
These first few aircraft were all given similar roles: scouting and reconnaissance. It had been foreseen that an aircraft overflying enemy lines could gather key intelligence such as details of enemy movements, troop concentrations, artillery positions, and logistical details in relative safety.
See what I mean? How just the use of like a Google Maps type of thing, but with overlays of actual photographs that were taken by scout planes, and then the red lines and the blue lines show all the trench networks. We have all these detailed bits of information, but finding ways to be able to merge it and use it with the technology of today is really so cool.
In fact, this is exactly what all major powers did in the early months of the Great War. And as movement gave way to stalemate and opposing armies dug in, the need for information grew, resulting in ever more demand for pilots and aircraft. It wasn't long before opposing unarmed aircraft were passing each other in the sky, often at close ranges, and the series of tit-for-tat developments which followed ultimately led to the modern fighter aircraft of today.
And these guys very often had their own paint schemes on these planes, right? And so pretty soon you got to know who was who. And everybody knew what the Red Baron's squadron looked like because they were called the Flying Circus because they had these very colorful paint schemes. And so it wasn't like they were all just a bunch of anonymous pilots out there. You got to know each other. And in some ways, they actually referred to themselves as friends. They were like frenemies, right? They were friends, but they were enemies at the same time.
It worked something like this. A two-man scout aircraft passing another on a given day may do nothing to hinder the operations of the enemy. But before long, the aircraft's observers would begin to bring pistols and rifles into the air and to take pot shots at the enemy and drive them away. The other side, of course, quickly responded, bringing their own weapons, such as shotguns and multiple pistols banked together.
Look at the pistols all together. This is what I mean. Necessity is the mother of invention. You start to think of ways you can up your game, ways you can be more effective with this stuff.
Provide extra firepower. On the ground, observers and fitters will work together to create mounts for light machine guns, which could be fired at the enemy from an observer's position. Single guns turned into pairs, and before long, aircraft whose purpose was no longer scouting, but actually attacking other aircraft were in development. Of course, the slower scouts needed protection, so the other side followed suit, and before long, numbers rocketed. Specialist fighter pilots were born, whose main role was to defeat enemy fighters and knock down the far more important enemy scout and reconnaissance planes.
And along with the technology advances, now you've got to come up with doctrine advances. And that's where you get guys like Oswald Boelcke, who is going to be basically the father of German combat aviation. He's going to be one of the guys who teaches the Red Baron how to fly and how to fight.
Things really changed in mid-1915 when Dutch aircraft designer and pilot Anton Fokker, working with the German government, came up with the famed interrupter gear. Itself an improvement on the French deflector gear developed by aerial ace Roland Garros.
Roland Garros, so the same name I think that's used for the tennis courts.
In short, this device could be synchronized with an aircraft's propeller rotation to allow a machine gun to fire through a spinning prop
Crazy
without
tech.
the admittedly major disadvantage of destroying your own propeller in the process.
Amazing.
In turn, this did away with the need for a second rearward-facing crewman, meaning that a pilot could actually point his aircraft directly at a target and shoot it down. The result was the birth of the true single-seat fighter. Whilst this development was underway, a young German aristocrat from Lower Silesia in modern-day Poland named Freiherr Manfred von Richthofen found himself in an elite, if a little outdated and underused unit. As a nobleman by birth, it had always been expected that young Manfred would go into the military, and the most prestigious branch of it at that, the cavalry.
And he's in the military, I think, for a couple of years before the war breaks out, 1910, 1911, something like that. And yeah, but the cavalry is going to very quickly become obsolete, replaced by tanks, replaced by planes, replaced by machine guns, all of which make the cavalry really a bad idea.
In early 1915, Manfred was an officer in an Ulan cavalry regiment, which, although it had seen some action early, was soon after dismounted and relegated to support roles behind the front lines. Frustrated and eager for action, Manfred applied for a transfer and in May 1915 joined No. 69 Squadron of the Imperial German Air Service as an aerial observer, serving in that role for several months. It wasn't until November of that year that young Manfred finally got a chance to pilot an aircraft of his own, training on the Albatros C-3 bomber, which he eventually took into combat against the French and later the Russians, claiming one unofficial aerial victory.
Yeah, so he starts out like a lot of guys do on the Eastern Front. Of course, that's close to home, right? He was born in what is now Poland. But large parts of Poland were controlled by Russia and Prussia for a good period of history.
Several months later, a chance meeting with German ace Oswald Boelcke changed everything for Richthofen. Always a keen student and possessing instinct honed in the hunt throughout his childhood, Manfred joined Boelcke's new Jagdstaffel, or fighter squadron, commonly referred to as a Jasta.
And so many of Germany's leading flying aces are going to come out of basically the Boelcke school, what was called the Boelcke Dicta school of flying. And then it's unfortunate that Boelcke himself is going to die because of a collision with one of his own guys, who was himself a great pilot and an ace.
Learning all he could from the great ace from the moment he first went into action as a fighter pilot during the Battle of the Somme. He adopted and refined Boelcke's tactics and applied his own methods with great success. Over the next 6 months, Richthofen claimed 31 aerial victories with Jastas 2 and 11.
So let's define a couple things real quick. An ace is somebody who has 5 aerial victories. Some people are called ace in a day because they get 5 in a day. I think Richthofen's best was 4 in a single day. So it was really, really rare to get that many in a single day. But anybody who has 5 is an ace. And the other thing is an aerial victory. We shouldn't refer to them as kills because it's not about how many pilots you kill. It's about, do you bring that plane down, right? So you could shoot down a plane but not kill the pilot. So there is a difference there. But if you look at the list of the aerial victories, which Richthofen had 80, I think he killed 79 people in the process, but many times that was 2 people that died in a single plane. So it kind of worked out about the same. But I want to take a look at some of the bulky dicta to give you a sense of what it was that the Baron was using as his standard when he flew. So here's some of it here. Try to secure advantages before attacking. If possible, keep the sun behind you. Why? Because it blinds the guy that you're flying at. He can't see you. Always carry through an attack when you have started it. Fire only at close range and only when your opponent is properly in your sights. Don't waste ammo because it's limited the amount of ammo you actually had. Always keep your eye on your opponent and never let yourself be deceived by ruses. If any form of attack it is essential to assail. In any form of attack, it is essential to assail your enemy from behind. If your opponent dives on you, do not try to evade his onslaught, but fly to meet it. When over the enemy's lines, never forget your own line of retreat. And for the Staffel, the squadron, attack on principle in groups of 4 to 6. When the fight breaks up into a series of single combats, take care that several do not go for the same opponent. And then, of course, there were additions that were made to that. And as he mentioned, the Baron comes up with his own things on top of it.
Including his own 11th victory, in which he shot down Major Lano Hawker, VC, the famed British ace.
Yep.
Richthofen himself remembered the event.
One day I was blithely flying to give chase when I noticed 3 Englishmen who had apparently gone hunting. I noticed they were flying in my direction, and as I felt much inclination to have a fight, I did not want to disappoint them. I was flying at lower altitude and constantly had to wait, until one of my English friends tried to drop on me. After a short while he came sailing along and wanted to tackle me from the rear. We cycled around and around, like madmen, one after the other, at 10,000 feet. First we cycled 20 times to the left, then 30 times to the right.
Think about that. I mean, this shows you he knows at this point he's dealing with a skilled pilot, right? It's not like you just go in there and shoot him down. I mean, they're dancing, right? I mean, they're doing a game. They're having a good old-fashioned, what we know today as a dogfight. Each one of them is looking for the advantage, looking for the opportunity where they're going to get to drop on the other one. And this is where skill comes into play, but also the abilities of your aircraft. How maneuverable is it? How much can you get out of it, and what do you know about what to get out of it? And this is why the technology is constantly changing, because you got pilots saying, all right, I had him, but I just couldn't get the plane to do what I wanted, so we've got to make it turn better, we've got to make it faster, we've got to make it be able to dive steeper or climb faster. So they're constantly looking for those edges.
Each trying to get above and behind the other. Soon I realized I was not meeting a beginner. He had not the slightest intention to break off the fight. However, my aircraft was better at climbing at this, and at last I got behind my English waltzing partner. The gallant fellow was full of pluck, and when we got down to 3,000 feet, he merrily waved at me as if he would say, "How do you do?" My Englishman was a good sportsman. But by and by the thing became a little too hot for him, after having endeavored in vain to escape me by looping and such tricks. I followed him down to 500 feet, firing all the time, and the Englishman could not help falling. Shot through the head 500 feet behind our line.
And they would have ways of confirming these victories, right? A lot of times they'd land, if it happened behind their lines, they'd land next to the plane and get some evidence of it. And the Baron would actually have these like commemorative like mugs and stuff made with the names and the type of plane and everything of the guys that he killed, where he was able to get that information. And we have the name of every pilot that he got a victory over, what kind of plane they were flying, where it happened, everything. The details are amazing. I've got this dream, if I get the time and the financial ability to do it, to go over there and do a video documenting all of these 80 aerial victories that he got, where they happened as best we can, and visiting the memorials to the guys who were killed.
It was Manfred's tactical mind and instinct which made him so effective. Singularly determined, but cautious too, he would, wherever possible, only attack when the situation favoured him. It was during these early months that Richthofen developed the habit of having a silver cup made to commemorate each of his aerial victories.
Yeah, and one of the things that sets apart him and a guy like Werner Voss, who I consider to be possibly Germany's best pilot that they had in the First World War. But the reason that Richthofen lasts longer and gets more aerial victories, I don't know that he was a better skilled pilot, but he was a smarter pilot. He didn't go into situations where he knew he didn't have an advantage. Whereas Voss ends up in a fight with 8 British aces at the same time, a fight the Baron never would have gotten himself into in the first place.
He would also often visit crash sites to take souvenirs, and on several occasions met and spoke with surviving aircrew he had shot down.
There's video of him, and you'll see some of it if you check out my video from the crash site that I made when I was over at the Somme. There's video of him standing and laughing with some of these captured British pilots.
Manfred's fame grew with his victories, and in January 1917 he was awarded the Pour le Mérite, commonly known as the Blue Max, at the same time being promoted to command his own Jaster. Flying alongside him at this time were Ernst Udet, who would go on to senior Luftwaffe command in World War II, and Richthofen's own brother Lothar, himself an accomplished ace. By April 1917, the Battle of Arras was underway, and Richthofen, now a household name in Germany, was in the thick of the fighting.
And it was in 1917 he writes an autobiography called Der Rote Kampfflieger. So I haven't read it yet, but it's something I very much want to get into. If any of you have read it, let me know what you thought of it.
A few months earlier, he had taken the unprecedented step of having his aircraft painted bright red. There is still uncertainty about the reason today. Richthofen's star continued to rise, and throughout bloody April, Jaster 11 achieved a legendary status, with Manfred alone claiming 22 victories in that single month. Shortly afterwards, Manfred was awarded the command of a wing of 3 squadrons, each of which followed their leader's example and painted their aircraft in bright colours.
Flying circus.
This flying circus, as it became known, was often thrown into areas where the fighting was heaviest, and more than once turned the tide of the air war in that sector. Badly wounded in the head in early July 1917, Richthofen spent some time recovering before returning to action.
He probably had a fractured skull from this, and there was a noticeable change in his demeanor after this. Got very dark, very subdued, and honestly, part of me wonders if his final demise wasn't in some way intentional.
Probably too quickly, several weeks later. He claimed a further 6 victories by the end of 1917, bringing his tally to 63, but was again forced to stop flying for several months. Whilst recuperating, Richthofen wrote a memoir of his wartime experiences, which gave an interesting insight into the calculating mind of a hunter.
My former excitement was gone. In such a position, one thinks quite calmly and collectively, weights the probabilities of hitting or being hit. Altogether, the fight is the least exciting part of the business as a rule. He who gets excited and firing is sure to make mistakes. He will never get his enemy down.
By April 1918, German ground forces were finally on the move. On the 21st of March, they had smashed through the Allied lines in the Great Spring Offensive and were desperately trying to split British and French forces around the city of Amiens.
So this is known sometimes as the Kaiserschlacht or the Spring Offensive. There's actually multiple offensives. The main one's Operation Michael. But yeah, the idea here is the Americans are now in the war. They're arriving by the tens of thousands. And pretty soon we're going to lose the advantage we have on the Western Front. So let's split the area right at the Somme, which is where the British and French lines come together. Let's cut off the British. Let's force them out of the war. And once we do that, the French will have no choice but to ask for terms.
Richthofen and his wing were once again in action, flying day after day in support of the offensive. On the morning of the 21st of April 1918, Manfred von Richthofen left his home aerodrome at Capi, flying a Fokker DR-1 triplane to begin a sortie westwards along the Somme River. Also flying that day was Manfred's 22-year-old cousin, Wolfram, a novice pilot who had been told to stay clear of any action. Some 25 miles away behind Allied lines at Bertangle Aerodrome, number 209 Squadron RAF was also getting airborne. Amongst them were Canadian ace Roy Brown and newly arrived pilot Wilfred May. The two men had been old school friends back in Canada, though May, who had much less experience, was very much under the guidance of Brown.
And these are the two who are going to go down in history, right? May for being the guy that was being chased by the Baron, and Brown is the guy who officially gets the credit for it, but as you're going to see, I don't think he did.
Like Richthofen's cousin Wolfram, May too had been told to stay clear of any action and observe. 209 Squadron were at that time flying the famed Sopwith Camel, a highly agile, fast and manoeuvrable biplane mounting twin Vickers machine guns. With very sensitive controls, it was notoriously difficult to handle for novices, but in the hands of a skilled pilot could be a match for anything in the air at that time. At around 11:45 over the village of Les Hamelles, 209 Squadron spotted a group of German Fokker triplanes and attacked them directly. A fierce dogfight erupted as May watched on from above. Several minutes later, May, no doubt frustrated at being relegated to simply observe, saw a single German aircraft apparently doing the same thing. Wolfram von Richthofen.
Don't you go after my cousin, is what the Red Baron's thinking in this one.
Seizing the opportunity, he set off in pursuit, trying his best to get the enemy aircraft into his crosshairs, not knowing that he too had been spotted. Witnessing this from some distance away, Manfred, in the main dogfight, disengaged and travelled at full speed to the rescue of his cousin. The first May...
Think about how that decision by Wilfred May changes history, right? If he'd have just sat back and doesn't go after Wolfram von Richthofen, does the Baron get out of there alive that day? Does he survive the war? Does he end up a general commanding Luftwaffe planes in World War II, like a lot of the other guys in his squadron did?
Was aware of it was the sound of bullets whipping past his open cockpit. He immediately broke off his own attack and put his aircraft into a barely controlled dive, spiralling down towards the Somme. As May descended, so too, uncharacteristically, did Richthofen.
And that's what he's saying, uncharacteristically, because Richthofen knew better than to get close to the ground. Why? Because there's ground fire. They're using the same machine guns that they would use on troops. They would also have anti-aircraft units that were focused on firing into the air. And if you got too close, you were in danger of being fired on by these guys.
Steadily closing on what was to be his 81st victim. As the pair broke...
His 80th, by the way, had come over a Rhodesian pilot just the day before that.
Through the main melee, they were spotted by Roy Brown, who too disengaged and gave chase. As all three aircraft approached the ground at high speed, with May weaving and Richthofen firing continually, Brown was trying desperately to catch up. With very little altitude left to help him, May began to weave along the River Somme back towards friendly lines, hoping the fear of ground fire would deter Richthofen. It didn't. Just as May had run out of ground and Richthofen, with at least one jam machine gun, closed in, Brown opened up with a burst of 303 fire from his own machine. Richthofen's aircraft was seen to bank steeply and turn to the right, close to the brick chimney of a factory.
And that's the key moment, right, as you're going to see, because the bullet that's going to kill him is going to enter from his lower right chest and exit up higher on the left. So I think it has to have happened right at that moment when he's banking that he's going to be hit from the ground. It makes perfect sense. And who's over there? Cedric Popkin.
Then continue on for a short time before turning 180 degrees and crashing down into a field just north of the River Somme. On the ground, troops rushed to the spot where the red triplane lay smashed. It's been a matter of debate ever since, Some say Richthofen was still alive and mumbled a few words,
Kaput.
others that he was unconscious. But what we can be sure is that within a few moments, Manfred von Richthofen, the highest scoring ace of the First World War, was dead.
And the bullet went right through his lung, through his heart, and through his other lung and out. There's no way that he survived a bullet from Brown long enough to put the plane down. It had to have happened after he banked and started heading to the ground. That's when that bullet hit him.
But who fired the fatal shots? It's a question that's been asked ever since that moment in April 1918 and is still hotly debated to this day. Let's look at the evidence. The immediate suggestion at the time, and in fact the official credited kill, was given to Canadian ace Roy Brown, who had dived on Richthofen from directly behind moments before he crashed.
So you can understand why it was given to him, but the evidence just doesn't point that way. Sorry,
he had
Canadians.
opened up with a burst of machine gun and was in prime position and certainly had a plausible claim. Brown himself would go and visit Richthofen's body shortly after the action and later left this incredibly powerful account.
The sight of Richthofen as I walked closer gave me a start. He appeared so small to me, so delicate. He looked so friendly. Blonde, silk-soft hair, like that of a child, fell from the broad, high forehead. His face, particularly peaceful, had an expression of gentleness and goodness, of refinement. Suddenly I felt miserable, desperately unhappy, as if I had committed an injustice. With a feeling of shame, a kind of anger against myself moved in my thoughts, that I had forced him to lay there. And in my heart, I cursed the force that is devoted to death. I gnashed my teeth, I cursed the war. If I could, I would have gladly brought him back to life.
What a very human way of looking at that. He did his duty. He engaged the enemy, an enemy who had killed many of his own side over the years. But in that moment felt nothing but regret over ending another human life. Would that we could all feel that way in those circumstances. It just shows you just the horrible nature of war itself.
But that is somewhat different than shooting a gun. I could no longer look him in the face. I went away.
Wow.
I did
I'd
not
never
feel
heard
like a
that
victor.
before.
There was a lump in my throat. If it had been my dearest friend, I could not have felt greater sorrow.
Wow.
No doubt Roy Brown's feelings were heartfelt and clearly the experience had a profound effect on him. But was it he who fired the fatal shot?
No, it wasn't.
In recent years, a perhaps more likely possibility has been put forward that it was in fact ground fire which ended the Red Baron's life.
And I don't know that that's strictly it's probably become more prominent in recent years, but I think there was plenty of speculation that was the case even at the time that it happened.
Two main candidates stand out. Either a Vickers gun at the north bank of the River Somme and facing north, manned by Sergeant Cedric Popkin, or anti-aircraft
There's your guy.
Lewis gunners Bob Buey and Snowy Evans, who were on a low ridge north of the Somme, looking east. Now let's combine this with what we know from the medical examination of Richthofen's body shortly after his death. There's some uncertainty here too, as not all post-mortem accounts agree, but it's generally held that the fatal bullet location was found, and that it was a single shot entering on the right side of Richthofen's body, passing through the main chest cavity, hitting the heart and right lung.
So there were 4 different doctors that examined him. They didn't do an autopsy. They did put like a piece of wire in the entrance wound to kind of follow the trajectory, and that's how they were able to figure this out. But they never actually did any sort of a autopsy to know for sure, and those doctors did somewhat disagree. And to this day, a lot of the disagreement comes down to whose side you want to take, right? If you're Canadian, you want it to be Roy Brown. If you're an Australian, you want it to be Cedric Popkin. If you're British, you want it to be the guys that were on the other side. And so we're never going to know for sure.
Before exiting slightly higher up at the left breast. This, if correct, strongly suggests ground fire.
From the
And
right.
in fact effectively rules out Roy Brown, who was shooting from above and directly behind Richthofen. So can anything be gleaned from his aircraft remains? Well, it was pretty heavily souvenired by Australian troops and subjected to enemy shellfire almost immediately after his death. So apart from knowing that Richthofen in his final moments had time to turn off his engine and fuel supply, proving he was at least alive for a few seconds after being hit, the aircraft itself can tell us very little. What we can do though is superimpose the various key positions over Richthofen's flight path in those final moments and examine the evidence. From the many eyewitnesses, we do know that Richthofen was gaining on the inexperienced May along the Somme River in his final few minutes. May decided then to make a treetop level dash for a low ridge to his right, in fact cutting it so close that his wheels touched the ground. We also know that Richthofen followed this route for a time, being shot at by Brown about the same time that he began his right turn. Richthofen passed to the left of Cedric Popkin's position at several hundred yards range, and again passed Buey and Evans to their right.
So Buey and Evans are over here, Brown is behind, Popkins to the right, and he banks to the right. And if the medical examination is correct, that the bullet came from below on the right side and passed up into his chest, there can't be anybody else that did this except Cedric Popkin.
All of whom were firing, before hurriedly banking and turning almost 180 degrees close to that factory chimney. His aircraft then reared up and crash-landed in a field south of the main road between the villages of Bray and Corbie. As we can see, the route Richthofen took was closer to Buey and Evans than Popkin, but the bullet entry from the lower right, if to be believed, would be far more likely to have come from Popkin, who was shooting from that angle for quite some time.
So that's the big if, right? If the bullet entered the way they say it did, it has to be Popkin. The only plausible explanation for it not being Popkin is if that was not in fact the entry.
The truth is, there's no real clear answer as to who was ultimately responsible for shooting down the Red Baron. Nor in the grand scheme of things should it really matter. I suppose like any success in the Great War, whether big or small, it almost always comes down to a combination of factors. In short, teamwork.
True. I mean, if May doesn't go after his cousin, if Brown doesn't pursue him, if you don't have these machine gunners firing, there's so many factors.
Following his death, Manfred von Richthofen's body was taken to Poulenville Aerodrome before being moved to Bertangles, where he was buried with full military honours.
And again, in my video that I have of this, I showed the video of the Australian soldiers burying him and doing a firing squad, the whole bit. It's really fascinating stuff to see. But he gets moved several times after that. He goes to Fricourt, then he's taken to Germany.
On the 22nd of April 1918. Video today exists of the funeral itself, attended by officers and men of the Australian Flying Corps and Australian Infantry. It highlights the esteem in which this enemy combatant was held, both as a pilot and also a worthy adversary. That wasn't the end of the travels for the Red Baron's remains, however. His body was moved no less than 3 times in the post-war years. First in 1920 to Fricourt German Military Cemetery on the Somme, then in 1925 to Berlin's famous Invalidenfriedhof, where bullet damage can still be seen on his headstone, fired by an East German border guard during an attempted escape over the Berlin Wall in the 1970s.
That's crazy.
And finally in 1975 to his family's home in Wiesbaden, where today he lies in the Richthofen family plot. The story of the Red Baron's life and death has captivated people for more than 100 years, and no doubt will continue to do so long into the future. What certainly shouldn't be overlooked in studying this period of history is the bravery shown by aircrew on all sides.
The bravery of soldiers in general in this war. It's just ridiculous how brave you had to be. But yeah, there's something captivating and fascinating to us about these knights of the air, isn't there?
To take to the air in mechanically unreliable machines, often without parachutes, with no guarantee of coming home, and to do so day after day, was and is incredibly brave and fully deserving of our remembrance. So that ends this battle guide video, which we hope you enjoyed and found interesting.
So great stuff. Please check out Battle Guide. They've got such great stuff, and I would encourage you to even check out a membership with them and see all of their tours that I showed you earlier. It is worth it if you're interested in this sort of thing, this sort of deep dive that gives you that kind of look from every angle of things. It's really, really fun and worth your time. Check it out. Thanks for watching.